I am Catherine Alexander, and we are going to talk either with or about Peggy Holman. She is the author of a book called Engaging Emergence, Turning Upheaval into Opportunity. And I will put a JPEG of that book and a link to its Amazon connection in the chat under this article when I publish the video. This whole month, we have been exploring living systems. And I think that emergence is such a unique property. And so few people really talk about it. And Peggy has spent years actually working with people in groups so that these groups actually can experience emergence. And I'm so happy to see you here. So welcome, Peggy. Welcome.
Thank you, Catherine.
Yes, it's been a while. We haven't talked in a while, but I'm just so thrilled to go back through the book. It's been really fun for me to reconnect with it and to really just refresh myself on what you wrote. So it's very neat, very neat.
Oh.
So do you want to share just a bit about who you are and what you do? And we'll put links also in the chat underneath, so people who view the video will have those references. But if you want to take a minute to talk about you, that would be great.
Sure. So my name is Peggy Holman. I live in the greater Seattle area, and I have been working with emergent practices for changing human systems since the mid-1990s, and became a student of what I've most recently come to call generative change, which are basically systemic approaches to high participation ways of engaging people to get clear about what matters to them and act on it, to self-organize to do that. And I'm the author of 2 books around that: the Change Handbook, which is an edited collection that first came out in 1999 with 18 practices in it, and we put out a second edition in 2007 with 61 practices. And it was actually that explosion of creativity in ways of engaging people in creating across difference that led me to write Engaging Emergence, Turning Upheaval into Opportunity, which was my attempt to explain the underlying principles of these practices that help people self-organize to create what matters to them.
Fantastic. It's when we talk about living systems, so often we don't talk about emergence hardly ever. I mean, very few people really talk about how systems change or what learning does to a system, or how we become more complex in a coherent way. Just not really part of the dialogue. So you're one of the few that I know that really engage with that. So that's kind of exciting. So I want to ask you, maybe first you should define how you hold emergence. That would be a good place to start. And then I'd like to talk about patterns of change.
Great. I'm smiling because that was actually great minds. I was thinking, what is emergence is a really useful place to start. It's also, I have to laugh if you Google that phrase, what is emergence? Beyond a dictionary definition, the first thing that comes up is typically the chapter out of Engaging Emergence answering that question.
Wow.
So,
wow.
Which I feel good about.
Yes.
My simplest definition, stripped down, bare essence of what is emergence. It is order arising out of chaos, which is one of those very counterintuitive kinds of things. So, when we think about chaos, order is the last thing we expect to come out of it. And that's part of the leap of faith and what tends to make emergence mysterious for many people. A more nuanced kind of definition, and I'm going to read this one that was what I landed in for the book, is it's higher order complexity arising out of chaos in which novel coherent structures coalesce through interactions amongst the diverse entities of a system. So I can say that again if that would be helpful.
Sure, go ahead. I mean, the picture I get, of course, is the mush in a caterpillar's body that the imaginal cells then coalesce around.
Yep. Yes, that's, the butterfly is, I guess, a higher order of complexity than a caterpillar, and certainly out of the mush that the caterpillar turns into on its way to becoming a novel butterfly. No other is quite like it. You are probably going to see a butterfly out of this, which is what's known as weak emergence as opposed to strong emergence, where you may not even know what is going to arise. And frankly, I will point to what's going on in Ukraine of setting the stage for strong emergence, in which something novel, something that didn't exist before, but a coherent, more complex structure coalesces because of the interactions among the many diverse parties that make up a system. And in an interesting way, the emergence is actually something all of us have experienced. And you can usually see a sign of it because there's some degree of overwhelm, some degree of disruptions that signal the potential for the emergence, for the birth of something new to arise. And just, I'll say a few more words about it if that would be helpful. Okay. It's an emotional experience. It's an emotional roller coaster ride, because the truth is, in the coming of chaos, that generally comes out of existing structures, whatever stable state had existed, collapsing, which means that emergence very often includes either real or structural death of things. So, for the people who had a stake in the way things have been, there's fear, there's mourning, there's grief. And for, those who are, without the same kind of attachment to the way things were, there's opportunity and can be quite exhilarating. And I have worked with journalists over the last 20 years. So an example, one of the things I have loved to do through the years is host convenings that bring together, young journalists who are, active in the digital world, good with social media, and longtime journalists. And there's this one gathering we held where, I heard the old journalists in mourning. This is some years back when the shock waves of the changes going on in journalism were really just beginning to sink in. And, I heard the older journalists wondering if they were still relevant. Was there a place for them in this emerging world, this new world? And the young journalists really excited about the possibilities. And what they discovered through their interactions were some really interesting partnerships where, the longtime investigative journalists suddenly found young people who were interested in learning more about how to do that. And the young journalist be able to offer the skills of, creating interactive kinds of ways of telling stories that added depth and texture. And so each of them had something to offer the other. And like many cases, when people who don't usually interact come together, one of the qualities in emergence can be finding light in the dark. I think hope is one of the things in the bleakest of times that a trust in the potential of emergence brings.
Yeah, I just love that. I want to segue for a minute, because when you started, something flicked through my mind. And so I just like to get your thoughts. When you talk about emergence's higher complexity and the emotional context of that, that made me wonder, and I don't know if you've thought about it, about the relationship between emergence and trauma. Because there's a lot of talk about trauma now and people. Yeah. And how you heal that and what that means. And my daughter is in that space. And so one of the things I've kind of noodled about is, in our own brain, we tend to order things. We tend to create a coherence of our understanding. And I think a trauma is a thing that doesn't seem to fit the order that we've got. And so if it doesn't fit the order that we've got, we can reorder it, which might be emergence, or hang on, which creates trauma. Thoughts?
I think it's a great question. And interestingly, I've been diving more deeply into understanding the nature of trauma for a number of reasons, particularly around the embracing of being a more inclusive culture. And interestingly, working with trauma can be a doorway to connection and understanding. So I hadn't looked at it through the lens of emergence, but what I think may be true of both is that knowing how to work with emergence may very well parallel the kinds of strategies that support people in working through trauma. And the example that comes to mind is I think that there's a shift because of this kind of emotional roller coaster ride of recognizing that emergence is about change, and it's about disruptive change. And one of the main ahas for me when I started seeking to understand emergence is that all change begins with disruption. And when you stop and think about it, it makes total sense, because if things are stable, there's no need for change. And so it's when we're disrupted, and sometimes the disruptions are small and we can kind of bat them down and ignore them. But if, and maybe make simple fixes, but if that's not enough, it will come back, and it will come back louder. And I imagine the patterns of trauma are very similar. If we don't go into it, if we don't deal with it, it eats at us and gets louder. And so one of the things that people have told me is just that insight of recognizing that where there is disruption, that if we establish a healthy relationship with disruption, that our capacity to move through goes way up. And we live in a culture that puts a very high value on certainty. I mean, we've been trained in a question answer kind of way of thinking, and that, you can get by with that when you're working with a stable state. but with the very assumptions on which everything, the structures in which we operate no longer hold. We have to find a different way of finding our footing. And one of the most practical things that you can do, I think, is to approach things from a different mindset. I have a colleague that I've done some work with recently, Juanita Roberson, who does a lot of work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Put it this way: what if fear isn't a warning, but is an invitation? And if we approach it in that way, with curiosity and compassion for ourselves and others, then we start with a radically different place in how we deal with what's coming. And I suspect that framing is as is as relevant to dealing with trauma as it is to working with emergence.
One of the things I learned in childbirth is that pain comes from resistance. Mm-hmm. And there's a difference between force and pain. Mm-hmm. And if you allow the force to be what it is, then it's a wave you kind of ride. And yes, it's strong, absolutely. And yes, it's out of your control, absolutely. But it's not painful, which is different. And the minute you resist it, then, the rest of your body is going, it's got to do stuff. And it hurts.
Yep.
Yes.
And, very often our first response to disruption is denial. Let's make it go away. And if that doesn't work, we try and manage it and, define the problem, create create a plan to deal with the problem and follow the steps. And, that works fine if you're repairing a car. But if the nature of the disruption, very often it has to do with inclusion. And some part of the system, be it a person or frankly even the environment, if we're not considering it in our view of who and what makes up the system, it can get quite loud. And so approaching that with a spirit of curiosity, compassion, and welcoming who and what shows up makes all the difference. And I'm actually leaping a bit into how I've come to work with emergence in organizations and in communities.
Well, I do want to hear about that, because I think one of the real gifts of your book is to get people comfortable with emergence. It becomes more familiar. It's not such a strange entity. And I think that's a true gift. So go talk about that. Yes.
Before I do that, I just wanted to say hi to,
this
Annie?
Is Annie. Annie Peggy Holman.
I have followed you for a long time. I've got your book. I've had it for like decades, I think.
Thank you.
And I love that list of what it requires, disturbance, diversity, and all that. I've always held to that. It's helped me. And I love what you're saying about disruption as a means of inclusion for emergence.
Mm-hmm. It's dollars to donuts. You're disrupted because there's some part of the system that says, "Hey, you're ignoring me."
I love that.
So
I've not heard that in the quantum physics approach to emergence, and what you're saying totally fits in there, and in fact would inform that perspective. Thank you.
Yep. So just to put some context around it, I think of emergence as a process. And it goes, I was talking a bit about some elements of that. If we start with a coherent state, there is a system that we know the rules of how it operates, right? So if it is in some way disrupted, God, I'm not sure where this will go, but what of course is coming to mind is the tragedy taking place in Ukraine. And, kind of the world order that has been in place since World War II. Well, we have a major disruption to how, countries interacted with each other. The basic assumptions of that have been undermined, and that, of course, creates fear and, quite in that case, literal death. But what's going on is a kind of differentiation. People are jockeying for permission or for position. They're experimenting. We're finding out who's talking to whom, and where does China fit into this, and what is North Korea thinking about what's going on with NATO members. As people interact with each other, and there's some cross pollination and conversations, and we are in the midst of new configurations of people interacting, and don't know yet how it will fall out in terms of a new and hopefully higher order coherence. Because the truth of it is, collapse is always possible. You don't necessarily have a higher order coherence arise. And being an optimist and believing it is possible to work with this pattern, which exists whether we work with it or not. So, from coherence, a system is disrupted. The assumptions that we could rely on no longer hold. That causes things to fall apart. Lots of experimentation, lots of grief, lots of fear, lots of excitement, lots of opportunity, out of which a set of assumptions ultimately come back together and a new coherence can arise, which of course will then in some way be disrupted and we're off to the races again. So if that's the framework, how do we design to work with that? And the thing that that I have found, and actually I've been told by psychologists, this works whether you're talking about an individual, it works with small groups, and actually I think as we have dealt with the pandemic, we've seen it on a large scale playing out before our eyes as systems arose to deal with testing and vaccination and so forth. So we've really been watching large scale emergence, which has been terrifying and exciting. But it begins, when I'm working with a group, when disruption shows up, my first instinct at this point, after I take a breath and to kind of center myself, is to seek to create a space that holds both compassion and curiosity. And I find there are three elements that go into creating a nutrient kind of space, or a generative space. And the first is getting clear about purpose, which I find most generative by asking a possibility-oriented question. So, given what's going on in the world, what is possible, given the shifts, what what are the issues and opportunity to create a better world out of the challenges we face today? So what makes a great question is that it is attractive. It's something you don't know the answer to and genuinely want to know the answer to. And holds appeal to the different parts of the system that you hope to attract. So purpose by way of a question, invite the diversity of the system. And there's a rubric that I've come to use and how to think about who makes up a system. And it actually comes from two different sources. I take from Marv Weisbord and Sandra Janoff, who created a practice called future search. When they think about getting the whole system in the room, which is core to their practice, they think about it by inviting the people who are in, the people with authority, resources, expertise, information, and need. So that gives you kind of a way of thinking functionally about who needs to be involved. And then the other layer I bring are demographics, and that I draw from the Maynard Institute for Journalism Education, which has been a leader in diversifying journalism organizations over the years. And they defined what they call the fault lines. And these are different demographics to consider, given your purpose, which of these apply. And it's gender, geography, race, class. I'm missing one.
Age.
Age, thank you, generation. And then they actually talk about two fissures that unfortunately I think have become full-grown fault lines in a number of places. One is political affiliation, the other is religion. And again, in growing awareness, there are two other elements: as to what extent you need to bring a proxy for environment to play. And then differently abled, to what extent do you need to take into account ability, disability. I'm not sure what the right language around that one is. So in terms of thinking about who to engage, that's a way thought process I use to identify that. And then welcome who and what shows up. To the points we were talking about earlier, is sometimes we miss something, and often the way it will show up may seem disruptive. So how do we practice that skill of welcoming with curiosity and compassion? So 3 things set the condition: purpose, inviting the diversity of the system, and creating a welcoming environment. And into that then is the invitation to engage. And there are an infinite ways of doing that I think all have 2 aspects at their heart. One is they support people in being willing to show up authentically, to bring their voice and to stand in it with clarity, and then to encourage connection. And it's through, early on in my work of trying to understand this, I was working with the Women's Leadership Institute, and I was asking the question, how do groups make decisions? And was observing this cohort we were working with that had to choose a project. And everybody was doing something that, frankly, women in trying to be cooperative all do, of saying, well, I'd be fine with anything. So everybody's being quite polite. And someone finally got tired of it and said, look, if we do this, this is what would really be meaningful to me. And that person coming forward to speak what was true for her gave others permission to do the same.
Mhm.
And once each of the women expressed it, what they discovered was that there were a few core elements that ran through everything.
Mhm.
And it enabled them to choose a path forward together. And I was told later by the person that had brought me into work with the group that was the first time they had ever had a group come to a decision without completely blowing apart first. And it's because we created the conditions that held compassion and curiosity for them to interact. And then one final thread, and I'll quit talking here, that runs through this is to listen for meaning. What is emerging? And to periodically test for what are we noticing of as we reflect together that holds meaning for all of us. And there's an insight from Jervis Bush, who did a textbook on what they call dialogic organization development, what I would now call generative change, because it's still got a lot of syllables, but it's less of a mouthful. He did some very interesting research that looked across a spectrum of projects using appreciative inquiry, which is a practice based in growing strengths, seeking, looking for possibility and growing it rather than focusing on solving problems. And what he found was those initiatives that out of which a generative image, and that could be a phrase. I mean, Kennedy's putting a man on the moon is an example of a generative image, but something that is compelling, draws us together, is concrete enough that we can begin to get a picture, imagine it, but ambiguous enough that there's room for experimentation and growth, that when a generative image emerges, we coalesce around it, and it acts as a catalyzing agent for a higher order complexity to emerge. And when that then forms a new set of assumptions, we end up with a higher order stable state, which of course will then be disrupted by something. And as I said before, we're off to the races again.
Very nice.
Do you have other thoughts on how to get people comfortable with generative change, to help them surmount the instinct to resist or push it away or whatever, to think about it in a new way?
Yeah. The thing that I have found most effective, because you're dealing with somebody who is in a fear-based mode, that
Right.
tends to be there, and they're holding on to the way things were,
Right.
is to start exploring with them what they really want. What would it look like? What are they seeking out? I have several wonderful stories out of the journalism work. I have a colleague who is doing an interview with someone, and they were stuck in this negative loop, and the journalists were not able to pull anything useful out of this conversation except woe is me, and here's the problem. And so out of desperation, they asked the question, well, what would you want? What would it look like if it were working? And all of a sudden that person shifted and started talking about, in some ways, the ways that had been in the past in terms of different groups that were now at odds, work together, listen to each other, connected. And they began to paint this picture of possibility. And there's a way in which that creation of a generative image for themselves leads to our capacity to create a question of possibility that becomes so attractive that it's something that they not only want to move towards, but invite others to join them in moving towards it. Now, that said, when you're working in an organization and you have leadership that, you know, where you talk about, oh, we're going to self-organize, and, you know, the fears that come up, it's like, what if nobody cares? Or what if it's all out of control, or they want to do something that isn't on my agenda? And, you know, one of the things I often say is that's good information for you. And again, that question of seeking the heart of purpose for them, so that you take it out of an intellectual explaining and into a whole body kind of, you know, where is heart, where is spirit? And most of the time, it's very rare that I've run into a situation where where I can't see reach the point that I see the light in their eyes when they begin to talk about, you know, what would they really like to have happen, or, you know, what do they want to create, or what would make a difference.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
So what kind of receptivity and feedback are you getting at this day and age than you did when you started? Is it more conducive to what you have to say, or is it more difficult?
I would say there's more desperation, which creates a different quality of listening. Actually, one of my favorite stories on that score is a number of, and there are more desperate people. So in a way, it's easier because there's more people willing to take a leap of faith. That, you know, recognizing they don't know how to solve it on their own.
Yeah, right.
And so that, as much as anything, creates an opening that wasn't there even 5 years ago. But this story was, I'd gotten a call from the National Institute of Corrections, and they were interested in how do we create a justice system that is more just, economic, and humane. Is that it?
Nice.
Just efficient and humane, something like that. I'm missing the one of them, but you get the gist of where they were going with that. And so we talked about doing something of this sort of generative change process. And we were in a meeting coming out the backside of an open space on the second day of this convening, and beginning to move into the where from here, and making commitments, taking action steps. And after deep and productive conversations, the people in the room were beginning to say, now, wait a minute, you want me to what? And the man who had brought this about started talking about how he sold this to his board. And, you know, so he's telling this group, you know, he's describing his proposal of doing this thing without knowing what the outcomes are going to be to his board, and his board saying, so let us get this straight. You want us to fund something, you don't know what the outcomes are going to be. You don't know what the steps of doing this are, or what the whole budget is going to be, and you want us to say yes to this? And his response was, yes, we have tried everything else, and nothing else is worth the trouble. And for me, he was the epitome. I mean, because he was clearly uncomfortable and stretched to his max in saying yes to this, and extraordinarily courageous in taking a leap of faith, because he knew everything else they tried hadn't worked.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nice.
Talk about the role of compassion in this.
You know, if you look at the Latin root of compassion, it's to suffer together,
Mm,
which I've calm is with, and passion, interestingly, means suffering. And I think compassion comes into play because of the complexity of what we're talking about. No one person can possibly have the answer. It takes us interacting with each other to be in it together. And because, again, we have a cultural norm that is about working from a very heady place. It's about facts and data and, make the plan and follow the steps. And if you, vary from it, you've done something wrong. So the idea of working in a more pioneering kind of way, the recognition that we create the path as we walk it, and by the way, we're in it together, is an essential part of it. And compassion means that we're no longer working just out of our heads, but with our heart and spirit as well. And that is what moves us in the material field. So it's a profound and necessary component, I find, in the work. It's, as long as we try, and I remember once years ago hearing a woman in an organization I was working with starting to get emotional and acknowledging, there is no place for emotions in our work. And I remember thinking to myself, this is probably 25 years ago, where, that was the expected norm. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, I don't think that's really true.
Yeah.
And what I know unequivocally today is if we leave our emotional selves behind, we won't solve it.
That's right.
Yeah.
We need we need the whole of us. And the phrase popping into my mind that, when I think about the larger cultural shifts, we have to reinvent the structures of civic life. Local newspapers, local bookstores, things at bowling alleys, the places where we used to connect with strangers and interact with strangers, that gave us a sense of e pluribus unum. We are all in this together, out of many one. The we has shriveled, and we desperately need to recreate that sense of we. And my own working hypothesis on that is that we do that by changing the cultural default for how we interact, from debate, which is all about advocacy. And if you look at the Latin root of debate, it means to beat down, to dialogue, which is really what these generative practices create the conditions for. And dialogue, its Latin root is meaning flowing through, dialogos, the word meaning, the flow of meaning. And it is fundamentally about inquiry. So it's the place of curiosity.
Wonderful.
Well, what you have to offer, especially at this time, is so valuable. Where are you wanting to go? What do you feel attracted to that your perspective, gifts, information could have the greatest catalytic reaction or help?
Impact.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that question, Ani, because my answer to it has actually been part of a more than 20-year journey at this point. I started working with journalists in 1999. So I'm going to actually, I'll give you the short answer and then backstory. You know, the thing I feel called to today is the what I was just talking about, the revitalization or the reimagination of of our civic institutions, our civic infrastructures. And it's a natural outgrowth. 20 plus years ago, there was a shooting at a Jewish community center in Los Angeles. And at the time, I remember thinking to myself, because of work I'd been doing with appreciative inquiry, the stories that we tell ourselves shape the way we see the world, and that shapes our behavior. And journalists are cultural storytellers, and honestly, even today, the stories that they tell us are not serving us particularly well. So how do we create a constructive form of journalism? And what I can tell you is that there are places that are doing that. There's something called the Solutions Journalism Network that is bringing a constructive approach to storytelling. A colleague of mine at Capital Public Radio in Sacramento just did a brilliant piece of work that they called participatory journalism, where they brought together police, social workers, and victims of assault for a series they called After the Assault. And they engaged with those different constituencies, both to do the stories and to create a field guide to help them all understand each other together and navigate what has been a horrific system for just about everyone. And that kind of journalism, it's nascent, but it's growing. I've come to believe that to accelerate the growth of constructive forms of journalism, that we need to look bigger through a lens of civic communication, or as a friend of another colleague calls it, civic information hubs. And I am, intrigued by the idea of bringing together those who see themselves as civic information hubs. And, in a narrow way, you could say that's libraries and local media of both broadcast and print, public media of various sorts, and bookstores and others. And at the broadest, you could throw in, hair salons and barber shops,
Your local gossip.
bowling alleys. So that, how do we mobilize the civic hubs in our communities such that we rediscover a sense of we, without losing the I? Because I think that's the higher order of complexity, is that it's not about sacrificing the I for the we, or the we for the I, but it's understanding the strengths of both. And one of the things that I have learned is that the most innovative solutions arise when we express our authentic self. When I truly show up as myself, the chances of us finding a solution that works for all go up.
Yeah.
I like the idea of civic hubs. Can you point us to where we could see one, connect with one, read about one?
I think it's mostly conceptual at this point, but I'll point you to an article that I think is quite inspiring. It's written by Daryl Holliday in the Columbia Journalism Review. And it's, I believe the title is "Journalism is a Public Good, Let the Public Create It." And he speaks of the notion of civic hub in that.
And DERRELL?
DARRYL. Let's see. let me,
Okay. And
uh,
holiday.
here, let me find it. It's DARRYL and holiday with 2 L's. And I'll drop a link in the chat here to his article.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Because that's a great idea.
Part of what haunts me, part of what takes me there is my niece, who's in her late 30s at this point. I was in an exchange with her and had shared an article about something related to our current political nightmare. And she wrote back and she said, I am deeply worried about the state of our democracy. What can I do? And we don't have good answers for that. It isn't obvious how to get involved. And it's the question that I would love to ask as, the institutions that see themselves as civic hubs, how do they mobilize to support people in answering that question for themselves, to find answers?
Well, one of the perplexing things that I have is that I have a great deal of passion for working with people to resolve things, but I've chosen to live in Santa Barbara, where nothing's wrong, where everything seems to be in balance. And I think about going back to Indianapolis, where my family is, and it's awful there. So it's an inner struggle for the work in the world I would do and taking care of myself to maximize my own well-being. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think there's find your kindred spirits, because it's not solo work. And where do you look for them? Boy, I think look at your own sense of calling, and where are the people you can go hang out with. I mean, if it's around conversation work, to connect people across difference, there's a group that's growing by leaps and bounds called Braver Angels that connects people across political divides. I have an approach avoid feeling about them. I in many ways applaud the work that they're doing, and they're working out of an old construct. They talk about not Democrats and Republicans, but reds and blues. But nonetheless, they've got it's too baked into the old system. And that said, they are teaching the people the skills of how to connect across difference. Or if issues around race, there's I've got another colleague who does workshops around what he calls the White Allies Toolkit. And his name is David Camp, CAMPT. And they have a growing community of folks of basically equipping white people to help increase awareness of around diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. Because fundamentally, we all want to belong. And how do we do that in ways that enable us to hear each other? And to our earlier discussions about trauma, to hear past the trauma or through the trauma, such that we reconnect with each other's humanity.
It seems to me that so many of the things we're working on is downstream, when upstream is the cause of it all. But that's the caste system. That's the hierarchical structures. That's how do we address that?
Well, one of the interesting things about the times that we live in, I don't recall the source where I read this originally, but I do find it to be true, that our organizational structures tends to follow our science. And hierarchical organizational forms came of age during the Industrial Revolution when, Newtonian physics, clockwork universe was the order of the day. Well, we now live in a time where we have the means of being able to see complexity in a way that wasn't possible before our digital age. And along with that, network forms of organizing, which are much more self-organizing, are emerging. And so part of the disruption is this huge transformation we're going from hierarchical forms of, looking to the command and control leader at the front, leading the charge, which we all know doesn't work anymore because the issues are too complex for any single person to be able to hold it. So network forms, and if you look at the basic dynamics of networks, they're quite different than hierarchy. And, there are two main, I started looking into that actually shortly after Engaging Emergence came out, because it seemed like the natural direction that self-organizing takes us is how do we work in networks? And what you find are two basic dynamics: the formation of hubs, which can look a lot like traditional organizations from the outside, but what's going on is quite different, in that it takes leadership that welcomes, and where purpose has enough clarity that it acts as an attractor, and the environments are welcoming enough that people stay out of choice, and to bring their gifts and contributions. Well, the other form of leadership, so that's what you need out of somebody or some group of people. Co-creation, co-directors, or that's becoming more common.
Very feminine.
It is, and the practices of attraction and clarity of purpose, which is actually a mix of masculine and feminine, are what help give are the glue of a hub. The other form of leadership isn't even something that we traditionally think of as leadership, and it's something I tend to call link leadership, because link, L-I-N-K, because networks are composed of hubs and links. And link leadership, these are the people who show up and disrupt what's going on because they've been hanging out with people who are on the outskirts of the margins. And they come in and bring in this new information that disrupts what's going on. And so part of the art is, and by the way, I discovered this because of a dear friend whom I loved very much, who always showed up late and disrupted things. And because I loved him, I wanted to figure out, what's going on here? Why does this always happen? And what I came to realize is his gift was in listening to the folks at the margin, seeing what was on the margin, and bringing it in. And so, for the people bringing it in, learning the skills of doing in a way that it can be heard. It may still be disruptive, but doing it in a way that it'll actually be heard. And if you're on the receiving end of it, to see the disruption as a signal, it's back to the Juanita's insight about approaching with fear as not as a warning, but as an invitation. How do I get curious about what's coming in? because what I have always found is that there are gifts in those disruptions if I'm willing to look for them. And so that's what learning to work with linkage looks like.
Very
So
nice.
how do you disrupt with compassion?
I do it through asking questions and generative questions. And frankly, that is something that is just an everyday practice for me. Anytime someone comes up and speaks in terms of problem or brings something disruptive, I'm listening for the question underneath. You know, what's the sense of purpose, and what is a question that I can ask that draws out what's behind whatever that disruption is. So I'm trying to think of an example. You know, it can be things as simple of what do you need in this moment, or what would you really like to see happen, or given all that's going on, what's possible now, or what matters to you in this situation. Things like that. But my it's back to that dialogic mindset, back to that being curious and compassionate. Ask a question that helps you see what is authentically there, that gets past the mind or underneath the fear.
I'm disruptive. I tend to be, and I tend to be representative of the margins. And I'm very passionate, and and that doesn't fly well. I'm wondering how have you approached your manner of delivery?
So when I first ran into the practice of bone dialogue, which is I think that kind of circle work is the foundation. It's the metaphor of the people of an indigenous community coming together around the fire, talking until there's nothing left to be said, and then the answer is obvious. It's how decisions get made because people are showing up authentically.
Yeah.
So I lost my train of thought. Annie, ask your question again.
Your approach, what with the truth and the passion,
yeah,
and calling that you have, how have you tempered your approach so that it's easier to receive what you have to say?
For me, that's where the compassion comes from. That it's not passion, it's compassion.
I know where I was going now. Thank you. I know where I was going. So as I started working with dialogue, one of the I made these cards that as a reminder of what I'm about to tell you, is anytime I feel myself wanting to say, I disagree with you, and here's the way I think about it. I take a breath, and by the way, breathing is really helpful. I mean, it brings me back into my body. It takes me out of the kind of angsty energy and roots me again. And then I'll say something to the effect of, that's a really interesting perspective. Tell me more. And then I really listen, because if I do that with the idea of beating the person up with whatever they say to me, guaranteed they'll never go there again with me. So I have to really listen and then play back. Did I get you? Did I hear what you had to say? And very often, as a matter of fact, in virtually all cases, when I get to the deeper understanding of what is motivating them, I find a place where I can connect to them as another human being.
Yes.
And then we start solving together.
Nice.
And so I make it when I'm triggered, I make it a search for, help me understand what's underneath that. Who is this person? I have another colleague who a number of years ago would bring together people from across the political spectrum. And they would always start with asking the question, what does it mean? What did it mean to you to be an American when you were 7 years old? And when people tell those stories, you can see the belief system that they hold today at its roots, the things that shape them. And generally, those deeper roots, the deeper values that inform them are things that we share, that we hold in common. It is where the unum of e pluribus unum is.
Mhm.
It just gets manifest in different ways, and because we rarely take the time to dive deeper into that place of understanding and the context in which people developed, it's much tougher to see their humanity.
Do you have a training component to what you do, to who you are, that you empower other people to kind of align with what's effective that you do?
Oh, me personally, I don't.
Okay.
A place I would send you would be the Art of Hosting community.
Hosting.
Art of Hosting.
Okay.
I think that they're one of the places, Catherine, you know them, don't you?
I do. I've heard of them. Yes.
I think that
I think they have a Facebook page.
yeah, they do, and their website has a number of resources on it, including their workshops that are done all over the world. And we share enough similarity in roots that I think it is a place to learn some of the practices that are congruent with the kind of framework that I was talking about, that does inform the core of my work and how I work.
Nice. Thank you so much. Did I hear you say you have a new book?
Oh, I wish
Okay.
I have two books. I think you came in later. The Change Handbook, which is the edited collection of systems-oriented participatory practices, and then Engaging Emergence, Turning Upheaval into Opportunity, which to me is about the patterns of change that inform how I work.
Right.
And you can look on my website or my Medium page.
Good.
I do write articles from time to time, and I'm
That's
looking
the one I have.
this.
Engaging Emergence is what I have.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, yeah.
And then the other book, which is older, actually, that
I got that one too.
this is the second
Oh, I don't have
edition
that.
of it. This was the first edition of it. As you can see, it got a whole lot fatter, and it was what drove me to write Engaging Emergence, to connect with the deeper patterns of change rather than, the myriad of methodologies for doing change work that are out there.
There's another group now called Liberating Structures, which
Yes.
has kind of taken some of that change work and applied it to meeting design, which is really pretty rich.
And I have mixed feelings about their work, because sometimes I have seen them skimming the top without having the nuance and depth
Yeah, I
to
can
do
see
it
that.
well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's why I would choose the art of hosting.
Yeah.
Although Liberating Structures is certainly growing fast, and at kind of an existential level, the more people who are out there doing this work and introducing people to new ways of interacting that are generative, I'm all for.
Yep. Yep.
Mm.
Wonderful. Oh, Peggy, it's been just very sweet to reconnect and to hear what you're doing and to listen to your wisdom. It's been very, very nice. Very
Well,
nice.
thank you for the invitation, and to both of you for your questions. And something I always like to do at the close is to kind of put this is in the seeking of meaning, to see what coherence is arising. I always like to end by saying, what's a nugget that you're taking from our time together, and that we each take a moment to speak to that and see what we discover from it.
What comes up for me is the coherence and meaning. That meaning is a coherence maker.
That's cool. I've never heard someone put it that way before.
What comes to me is your weaving. It's like you're weaving the organizations and the principles and the states of mind and the conditions, and it's wonderful the way that you're weaving all of the aspects of the work that you offer, because it's not just a set of this or a set of that. It's a living thread. You're the living thread that's connecting all of these different approaches and frameworks. And I like that. And I want to emulate that. Thank you.
And for me, there's something in the questions that you asked that I find validating, in terms of, as I was answering, I found myself drawing from 30 years of work to create what I do believe is an emerging picture of a shift into the basic forms of how humans organize to be places of belonging and meaning and potential.
Nice.
Yeah, it's lovely.
It's self-organizing toward places of belonging. And I mean, you could craft a statement, craft something to remember. Yeah, it's not just self-organizing. It's self-organizing toward a belonging together.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that's inherent in life. It's the fit. We give fit short shift. We don't understand how important it is and how subtle it is and how relationship oriented it is to come into coherent relationship with each other, and the changes that we all have to make that happen. That's foundational in nature. It's how ecologies function and keep being robust over time. And we have so lost that because we've fragmented and we've stopped seeing how we fit, even though we search for it and we want it, but it's a diluted, a very thin way of connecting. It's not deep, and it's the deepness that gives us that robust foundation.
And the search for fitness is the essence of evolution. It's
exactly.
Whether it's the amoeba,
yep,
or a human, it is what we are always seeking.
Yep. And that's where the new order comes from.
Thank you
Oh,
so
well,
much, Peggy.
You're quite
yes.
welcome. And
Thank you.
be well, and send me a link when you have one,
I will do it. I will do it.
Good,
Okay.
and I'll post it on my website.
good.
So
Okay.
thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.